So with the Dutch Grand Prix coming up this weekend, I thought I would visit a very heavy story from a particular Dutch Grand Prix. It's something you might have heard about if you've watched any F1 documentary on safety or just the history of F1 in general, seen it on Matt Bishop's On This Day tweets, or just anything to do with Formula 1 whatsoever, because it's quite an important part of F1 history. It's basically the moment when the FIA, Formula 1 and the rest of the motor racing world went, well, it looks like Jackie Stewart was right after all. Now, aside from the 1994 season, the safety aspect and how that has evolved over the years has become a central part of the channel, and how it's grown and presented the history of motor racing over the last, getting on for 6 years now. So we need to learn how Formula 1 got to this point, specifically, and by that I mean the 1973 season. So we've got about 7-8 years of history to recap, but don't worry, it won't take long. I do these bits to give extra detail and context. You wouldn't watch The Departed and then skip straight to the last 20 minutes, would you? You'd think that Matt Damon was the good guy and DiCaprio was the bad guy, when it's the opposite. Sort of. I mean, I won't spoil it any more than that. But back in 1966, Jackie Stewart had been involved in a horrendous accident at the Belgian Grand Prix, crashing when a sudden downpour flooded the Ardennes forest. He'd crashed at the notorious Master Kink, one of the most terrifying corners not just in Europe, but the world, and had crashed into a woodcutter's hut on the exit of the corner. Trapped in the car, Jackie was being soaked in fuel that was burning his skin, and the electrics were still on. One spark, and that would have been it. He'd have been gone. But luckily, Jackie's good friend Graham Hill as well as Bob Bondurant had crashed nearby, and Bob and Graham switched off the electrics and then had to borrow a spanner from a member of the crowd to get Stewart's steering wheel off. After which, he was taken to a dirty medical tent that had cigarette ends all over the place, and the only person available to give him first aid was a nun. When an ambulance finally turned up, it got lost on the way to Liège. Jackie survived with a few broken bones, but he was amazed at how bad it was. There were people on the battlefields in Vietnam that had access to better medical care. So Jackie, Graham, Jack Brabham, Joe Bonnier and a few other drivers started to band together to really push for better safety at Formula 1 tracks. The Grand Prix Drivers Association had existed since 1961, so it wasn't a new thing, it was just that they were having a bigger push. And the circuits didn't believe them when they started making threats. It was only until they boycotted the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa and the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring that they realised that, these guys mean business. Safety improved over the next few years, but it was slow and difficult. The drivers and the FIA said the circuits had to adapt to the cars. The circuits said it should be the other way around. And by the late 1960s and into the 1970s, most of the changes that modernised the circuits had been done. Armco barriers at tracks, straw bales banned after the fiery crash that killed Lorenzo Bandini, and roll hoops added 5 centimetres above the top of the drivers' heads to stop their heads making contact with the road in the event of a roll. But deaths were still common. The late 1960s were among the deadliest on record, with 5 Grand Prix drivers killed during 1968 alone. With the advent of wings on the cars, the transition towards full slick tyres and everything else going on in the arms race that is Formula 1, the cars were developing so fast the tracks couldn't keep up. As such, by 1971, Spa had already been dumped off the calendar because the drivers refused to race there with the way the cars were developing, and even with the chicane at Malmedy Corner, the cars were averaging over 150 miles an hour on an 8-mile lap. By contrast, Rubens Barrichello's fastest lap around Monza is 159 miles an hour, and I reckon that without that chicane, pretty much the entire section from Les Comtes to Blanchimont would have been borderline flat with not much lifting at all, with the wings that they'd got on the cars by 1970. So Formula 1 was moving away from tracks that were longer than 5-ish miles. So Spa was gone, awaiting improvements. They were getting rid of places like Charade, they were getting rid of places like Rouen, they were getting rid of places that were basically open roads, and they were moving to more purpose-built facilities like Paul Ricard and places like that. But there was one other track on the calendar that was fast, flowing, and above all else, dangerous. Zandvoort. Zandvoort is located on the Dutch coast, near the town of the same name. It's located to the northeast of the town, with Zandvoort itself being not too far from Amsterdam. It's surrounded by sand dunes, and today it's also surrounded by a golf club and other amenities, with the circuit up until a few years ago being home of touring car races and other lower level categories. In the last 4 or 5 years, Zandvoort has seen some pretty hefty renovations to bring it up to modern Formula 1 standards, as Formula 1 wanted to take advantage of the popularity of Max Verstappen and bring in a lot of Dutch fans to the area. As a result, a few corners had banking added to allow for some overtaking opportunities and different lines to be taken, and when driving it in F1 related games and in things like R-Factor 2 and Assetto Corsa and iRacing, it's not a track I particularly enjoy. If I was to describe it to anybody, I would say it's Europe's Laguna Seca. And when translated from Dutch to English, Zandvoort translates roughly to Sandford. No luck catching them Red Bulls then? Well, it's just a one Red Bull actually, because, you know, one of them's a lot faster than the other one. But still, back then, Zandvoort was like a miniature Spa. You had to be laser guided, otherwise one mistake and that was it. You were gone. It was not unlike Monaco, really. And one mistake, one failure is what happened to Piers Courage during the 1970 Dutch Grand Prix race weekend. During the race, Courage had damaged his car suspension after hitting one of the raised curbs that was not that far removed from the ones you see outside your house on the pavement. And a little bit later on, after getting that damage, the suspension failed. He went straight on at Tunnel Oost, went straight up an embankment, rolled, and the car exploded. Courage would have been burned alive in the car if not for already being killed by one of the wheels striking him in the head. The fire was so violent that it ignited nearby trees because of the way that the fuel spilled out across the accident site and then went up as it sparked because, well, fuel is incredibly flammable. But it wouldn't be the first time that it would happen not just at Zandvoort, but that season. Because at Jarama, Jackie Ickx had been sideswiped by his 1969 Le Mans teammate Jackie Oliver, and both cars burst into flames, like a light switch going on. Fire was the big thing in those days, and take it from me, having been burned in a fire, you know, a proper fire like car, house, whatever, it's not fun. It's agony, and I can't think of a worse way to go other than drowning. There were 3 deaths in 1970, McLaren, Courage and Rindt. Ickx and Oliver could have easily upped that tally to 5. The drivers still had that little bit of arrogance to think, no, it will happen to somebody else, but it was a coping mechanism as well as arrogance. It was the way that they got through everything. But the problem is, if you're thinking it'll happen to somebody else, and you've got other drivers thinking it'll happen to somebody else, you become somebody else's somebody else, if you follow me. So if Formula 1 was as dangerous now as it was back in 1969, 1970, 1971, and you had, say, I don't know, Verstappen thinking that, he'd be thinking it's going to happen to one of the other 19 drivers on the grid. But if you've got Bottas, Sargent, Norris, Piastri, Hamilton, Sainz, Leclerc, all thinking that too, suddenly Verstappen isn't so safe. You are still on that thin line between survival and disaster, as explained by Sir Jackie Stewart, and it's amazing how nobody had been killed at the previous round to the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix because there'd been a Spa 1998 style pile-up on the second lap of the British Grand Prix that wiped out half of the grid. It resulted in only the second red flag in F1 history, at the time anyway, as they tried to tidy everything up. I watched the crash just before writing this section, and it makes for pretty uncomfortable viewing. So they went on to the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. With no horse, no pun intended, in this championship, Ferrari decided not to turn up so they could focus on improving the car. It was also the return of the Dutch Grand Prix to the calendar, as it hadn't been on the 1972 schedule because it was being upgraded with new barriers and getting a resurfacing job and improvements to other facilities. And actually, as it so happens, when the teams turned up, they found that space in this new paddock was pretty small, because there were construction workers still there putting the place together. It's all part of how amateur the sport was compared to now. But it was all okay to go ahead, as the Dutch Grand Prix was now run by the Dutch Racing Association and would be under contract for 15 years. And when you watch videos like this that talk about things from the late 60s into the early 1970s, chances are the pictures that I use are from a Dutch Grand Prix of some description, because the Dutch National Archives has got loads of them on Wikipedia Commons that are brilliant to look through, and there's footage as well that has been used a couple of times. Zandvoort was now wider, smoother, and had sufficient barrier coverage that should help avoid another Piers Courage type situation. They had also installed a new corner after the fast sweeping right handle at Tunnel Oost to try and slow the cars down, and this is sort of a more open version of the chicane towards the end of the lap that you see today. The circuit, as a result of the improvements, now had wider gravel traps in places, but still had far too many points too close to the track to stop any errant cars, and the drivers and teams were happy with the track itself, despite the fact that other parts weren't finished yet. Practice was held in utterly miserable conditions. It was absolutely chucking it down, visibility was poor, and if you could see out over the track, you were then greeted by the grey, murky, depressing North Sea, a view I know all too well, having grown up on the eastern coast of England. And a lot of the drivers liked the new section and some didn't like it. The ones that didn't like it would have preferred it to be more fast and flowing as opposed to having a more stop-start nature to it. But on Saturday the weather improved and the cars were able to go out there and test the new track in better conditions and in conditions that would be more indicative of what they do in the race. For qualifying, Ronnie Peterson, the Super Swede, stuck his car on pole ahead of Stewart by around half a second, with Francois Sever a tenth and a half off his mentor. Hulme's McLaren, Reutemann's Brabham, Revson's McLaren, Hunt's March, Pache's Surtees, Beltoise's BRM and Oliver's Shadow made up the rest of the top 10. One other driver of note here is Ricky von Opel driving for Ensign, who is from Liechtenstein of all places. But really we need to be looking further down the grid because that's where the main bulk of this story happens. We need to be looking away from the likes of Lauda, Stewart, Sever and people like that. We need to be looking at the people in 18th and 21st, Roger Williamson and David Purley. The race started at 2:30 PM and Williamson had encountered issues getting to the grid, but he was able to leave the pits and sprint round to get to his starting spot with mere seconds to spare. At the same time, a kerfuffle had begun because the rules were, at the time, it was the car and driver combo that the qualifying time is allocated to, and Emerson Fittipaldi had been prepared to start from the third row of the 3-2-3 starting grid, so the second row of the three wide starters. Emerson had set a lap time good enough for 6th or so in a car that he'd wrecked, and he was starting the race in a different car, so he got dumped back to row 7. This was a common thing back then. Sometimes drivers would qualify in one car but then race in another car. Jim Clark did it a few times, Graham Hill did it a few times, Jochen Rindt did it a few times, and other drivers, because they would go out in one car, go, oh, this one's not particularly good for this particular type of track, then go out in the other one and go, oh, I like this one better because it's faster, it's easier to drive, it's safer, etc, and then that's the one that they would use. But basically what had happened was Fittipaldi had crashed in qualifying and then had to use a different car, and there was that kerfuffle with the rules and regulations, so instead of starting on that second row of 3, he had to go further back. A pattern developed at the front with all the top names out ahead, but further back, Jackie Oliver's car had developed a stuck throttle and he crunched a guardrail right in front of the car's designer, Tony Southgate. Then, a lap later, Fittipaldi retired as the injuries sustained in the crash on Saturday were too much for him and he couldn't press the brake pedal hard enough anymore. Cars were dropping like flies as Van Opel never started, Oliver had his accident due to his stuck throttle, Mike Butler had electrical problems, and Fittipaldi had to listen to his body. And that was in the opening 2 laps. But lap 7 is the most famous part of this race, for all the wrong reasons. Roger Williamson was in only his second Grand Prix for the March team. He'd originally tested for BRM, but when an offer came through to drive for Mosley's outfit, he took the chance. March had a better car than BRM and they were doing much better than they had been in 1972. On lap 8 of the race, Van Lennep had gone through and there was a large gap before Graham Hill and his train of cars arrived. But something was amiss. The 2 bright orange STP Marches of Williamson and Purley were nowhere to be seen. Williamson had suffered a rear tyre failure or a rear suspension failure, depends on the story you're reading, and he'd gone straight on at Tunnel Ust and smacked into the guardrail at about 130 miles an hour at a 45-degree angle, whereupon the car rolled over and exploded. Cohen Vega, the author of Formula 1 Fanatic, was at that race as an 11-year-old boy and saw exactly what happened, and he described it in detail in the documentary Life on the Limit, which is a brilliant documentary if you've never seen it. I saw a car flying through the air and I looked straight into the cockpit. It was like a flash, and the car smacked into the asphalt. Joe Ramirez, who worked for McLaren, said David Purley stopped his car, got out and was trying to lift the car, and there was lots of people just watching. Nobody came to give him a hand, and he was desperate. The footage of it is all online. It's pretty easy to find. If I could put it in here, I would. But the body language from Purley is just... well, there are no words. He's waving frantically at the marshals to help him, and I wonder if any of them were able to understand him. One of the people present, who looks to be a police officer, throws a fire extinguisher the other side of the barrier and just stands there half-assed waving at cars to slow down. Meanwhile, Purley bends over in emotional exhaustion, and it's said that he heard Williamson screaming in agony inside the car. He tried one more time to roll the car over despite it being futile at this point, and gives up. knowing that his friend is gone. So he turns his attention to waving at the other cars to slow them down, and that wasn't working either. All they had was a local yellow. We passed it every lap. Yellow flags were being flown to slow us down, but the race was never stopped, Stewart recalls. In those days, they didn't stop races. Purley finally walks away from the car, still trying to slow the other drivers down, and you can see by his body language that he is going through a raft of emotions, sadness and anger mostly. But because he'd stopped his car, got out and tried to help somebody else in distress and tried to save their life at the expense of his own, he was awarded the George Medal, which is the highest civilian bravery award in the UK. Williamson's car was left at the side of the road while the race continued. The Dutch National Archives has a couple of pictures of the smouldering wreckage, but they're of the underside of the car, so it's hard to tell, but there's every possibility that Williamson is still in the car when the pictures were taken. Lap after lap, Denny Hulme waved frantically at the organisers to try and get something done, while Reutemann's Brabham had a tyre delamination at turn 1, but managed to come to a stop safely. The death hits that extra bit harder when you realise two extra things. Number one is that it was only Williamson's second ever Grand Prix, and at the previous Grand Prix he'd been in, at Silverstone, he'd actually been involved in that opening lap pile-up that involved Jody Scheckter and lots of other people, and he'd got away completely unscathed. And I've been on Wiki Commons on the Dutch National Archives portion of that particular site to get pictures for this video and, well, other videos that I've done on the channel before, particularly for the 1960s and 1970s stuff, and there is a picture of Williamson's car put back the right way up. Inside the car is Williamson, just limp, covered in firefighting foam and bits and pieces like that, and it's just haunting to see the body there. It's like the Tom Price accident, the Dan Weldon accident, Ratzenberger, Senna. It's an image you won't get out of your head anytime soon. The race continued until its conclusion. Much like the 1976 German Grand Prix or the 1977 South African Grand Prix or similar, this incident dominates the headlines, and people will only be able to recall this one thing. They won't be able to recall who actually won the race. Stewart did, for reference, and the Williamson fatal accident overshadows the fact that Stewart had become, at least at that time, Formula One's most winning driver, overtaking Jim Clark for the most amount of wins, another driver who had, tragically, lost his life in a racing accident. But the Williamson accident was testament to the fact that Formula One still had a lot of work to do. Francois Sever would also be involved in a fatal accident at the end of the season, and Jackie Stewart walked away from the sport in the immediate aftermath. The cars were still time bombs. It's thought that when Williamson's car rolled over, the fuel tank had ruptured and the roll hoop sparking on the tarmac ignited it. That was all it took. The race had also been shown on international television, and the images of Purley waving his arms, gesticulating wildly to people who might not speak the same language as him, and trying to save his friend while people stood and watched, were broadcast to living rooms all around the world. And as a result, Formula One was shamed into doing more. And that was the thing. It had to have its reputation knocked back a bit to have something done about it. He was an ordinary working class lad who had done it all by his own talent, said Max Mosley. Those things have a big effect on you. Following the accident, the FIA stepped up its fire suppression procedures and equipment and made sure that marshals were equipped to deal with fires. Fire suits on par with the driver's ones, helmets and everything else that they'd need, as the fire extinguishers they had at that race weren't meant for those kinds of infernos. But that was Formula One in that era. There was still some opposition to Jackie Stewart and the GPDA safety crusade, and there was still elements of, oh well, happens, people die in racing cars, deal with it, if you don't like it, slow down, and things like that. And the drivers who were campaigning for the safety could recognise the hypocrisy. I mean, Jackie Stewart certainly did. So what I'll do, because this video has now got super heavy and all of that stuff, I'll leave you with some words from the man himself. When the visor goes down, you escape from the grief and the drama, the troubles, the pain and the suffering, and it's only when you come back and the visor goes back up that you become aware of the reality again. People thought we were gladiators, and if you went into the Colosseum, you knew there was lions in there, and chances are you wouldn't get out.